Adobe Digital Editions. Star Trek_Deep Space Nine. A Stitch in Time. Andrew J. Robinson. EPUB window. Focus on book content text. What's your favorite plant? She asked. The Eidosian orchid. I replied without thinking. Yes. She nodded. It has an extraordinary blossom. Have you grown them? I asked. No. I'm afraid I don't have the patience. It has not so much patience, I think, as it is the willingness to live with their mystery. How do you mean? She was a genuinely curious person. They read deceptive. They appear to be rather common at first, but if they're treated well, if you watch for the clues carefully, they'll almost tell you how to grow them. But I was never under the impression that they were common. Her smile was deeply engaging, and I felt somehow that the distance had narrowed. We had come to an understanding. But I must get some sleep. The Durbo tables spin early tomorrow and I'm on a shuttle back to Batter in the evening. We rose. She held her hand out to me. It's an unaccustomed gesture for me, but I took it. Her grip was warm and firm. My senses were alert. When you return, I hope you'll visit my shop. I'd be happy to serve you in any way, I said. That's very kind. Thank you, Elim. A familiar, pleasant sensation went through me when she said my name. And I, too, would be pleased to serve you however I could. She squeezed my hand slightly and left the way she came. The understanding, I thought as I watched her graceful strength move away, was that this was only the beginning of the game. Book content text. 18 entry: A strong wine blew just before sunset and I hoped that it would continue. It would make our task of getting past the Ramaclan flanks much easier. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon behind us, the wine stopped, and the darkening wilderness was preserved in a resounding stillness. I took a deep breath. Lubac. Sharaban growled with his gruffest voice. I stepped forward from the mass of our troops who were standing in formation in front of the eastern gate, and marched up to Sharaban, who was flanked by Dragger and Fat Sharaban. It always amazed me how he was able to transform himself and become whatever person the situation, the context demanded he be. I wondered if Sharaban was part Ragnar. We'll wait for your signal, Lubac, but if there's any indication that your teams have been exposed, we'll attack. In that case you must do whatever is necessary to prevent their flanks from collapsing in on us. Understood? Yes, one Sharaban. I replied. Position your men and begin, he ordered. I nodded to 8, and he stepped forward with his team, 5 and 7. I could see that 7 was wide-eyed with tension, but 8 had assured me that he was ready to fight. 5 appeared as solid as ever. 8 gave me a last look before he led his team to the north and disappeared in the gathering darkness. I motioned to 3 and 4, and they stepped forward from the ranks. 4 looked typically bored, but 3 surprised me with his apparent calm. He had been a difficult student during the training sessions, and I was anxious about his performance. For the Empire. Sharaban growled. Victory. We roared in answer. As the main troops deployed, I led my team south to a predetermined rock formation. These were the last rocks we would have as cover until we met the enemy. Before us was the exposed desert slope that led to the enemy position. We had been instructed to wait here until the first assault probe was launched. This probe consisted of a small team that would be sent right up the middle of the slope and straight toward the enemy redoubt. The purpose of the probe was to draw enemy fire, during which we would hopefully get an idea of how their defenses were aligned and then begin our own advance during the brief engagement. The probe, of course, was a purely tactical move and had no chance of success. We scanned the now moon-saturated darkness as we waited for our moment. Last equipment check, I whispered. Ready, for replied after a moment. 3. Did he hear me? What? He snapped. Equipment check! Yes, I'm ready. How many times are you going to ask? 3 hated the fact that I was in charge, and during the training he had grudgingly taken instruction when he realized that mastery of my stealth techniques was absolutely necessary for success. He wasn't bright, but he was ambitious, and he was hoping for a number 1 designation at the next evaluation. Response to the probe should have happened already. It was being launched as we moved out. I could only guess that the enemy, aware of the tactic, was allowing the probe to penetrate as deeply as possible until it nearly reached the redoubt, at which point it could be intercepted without the flanks ever revealing themselves. The probe had been to Sharaban's idea, and when I brought up this lack of enemy response as a possibility he dismissed it. Book content text. What's going on? Ford demanded, with more concern in his voice than I'd ever heard. He was a clever operator, very observant. He gauged the temperature of any given situation and acted accordingly. He wasn't as accomplished as Sharaban in this regard, and you never knew where his true loyalty was, but he always took care of himself. Nothing is going on that's going to help us, I replied, concerned that we were losing precious time. Let's go. We're supposed to wait for the engagement. 3 resisted. Let us go. That's in order. I was the leader, Sharaban had told me during the last planning session, and I must never allow the challenge to compromise my position. Triangulate. I'm in front. 4 rear right. 3 rear left. I wanted to keep 3 as far away from the enemy flank as possible, since he was the biggest and least adept at stealth. We began the slow crawl. I immediately flattened and spread my consciousness, feeling my breathing respond accordingly, movement only on a long outgoing breath, complete stillness on the intake. The 3 of us had to be synchronized, and I could feel Ford adapt beautifully to my pattern. 3 struggled, as I knew he would at the beginning, but with 4 and me holding the pattern he was able to settle in. We moved as one. We heard the response to the probe, and as I had anticipated, it revealed nothing about the flanks, at least on our southern side. I had no idea how they would angle the flank out from the central defensive position, and this meant we had to proceed with extreme vigilance from the beginning. My only concern was not with the moonlight. Even with the ghostly illumination we could blend in well enough, but with the total lack of wind, unusual for the Micker. 4 and I made almost no sound, but 3's bulk made enough of a dragging sound in the sand to warrant concern. Then I heard a sound coming from the darkness in front of us. I had forgotten that the lack of wind could also work to our advantage. It couldn't be their flank, it was too soon. And why were they moving? We stopped and listened as the sound, the slow and muffled crunching, came closer and extended from right to left. The flank was moving toward us. I could make out the shadowy outlines of enemy soldiers, evenly spaced and moving with precise coordination in order to minimize all sound. It appeared that the flank was executing the hinging maneuver that would sweep its southern side. If the northern flank was doing the same maneuver, then both flanks, connected to the central redoubt, could conceivably meet in the middle. But this kind of pincer movement could leave them exposed to being outflanked, unless they were almost on top of us. This was our first test. I prayed that 3 and 4 were focused, and that an enemy foot came down next to my head, the other foot brushed my side pack. I could hear 3's breathing turn ragged, but thankfully the passing crunch, crunch, crunch was dominant. They passed, and I waited to see if there was any activity from the north that would indicate exposure of the other team. Nothing but the receding crunch, crunch, crunch. 3's breathing began to settle, and we moved ahead. Time becomes meaningless working with this kind of concentration, only objects and events mark progress. But I knew our coordination was strong and sustained. This had been my concern from the beginning of training. It's one thing to work by oneself, it's another to get a unit to work as one. But when it happens, the mystery is how the flattened and spread energy of each is transformed into the energy field that sustains and propels all. At one point we encountered a much thinner and fixed line of sentinels who were guarding against any outflanking Sharaban maneuver. By then we were so well coordinated that there wasn't a ripple of anxiety in our unified field as we passed them. Just as I was beginning to hope that perhaps we would have a clear path to the redoubt, again I heard a faint crunch, crunch, crunch from behind us. The hinge was swinging both ways. We stopped, and returning anxiety dissolved our unity. As we waited, I could feel the night chill creeping into my body and creating a tremulous reaction. The more I tried to resist, the more I trembled. I was now afraid that my cooling body would betray me to the approaching soldiers, who were just behind us. I was planning how I would respond to being discovered when the soft crunching sound stopped. We waited, in a long silence broken only by the distant cry of book content text. The night hunting for prey. My trembling became worse. No matter how I tried to employ my technique, my body was too chilled to respond. I wondered if 3 and 4 were also struggling. I had lost contact with them. Suddenly the crunching sound began again. I put my hand on my phaser. I was on the verge of jumping up and taking out as many of the enemy as I could. But now the sound was receding. We must have gone beyond the limit of the flanks hinging arc. Yes, they were moving back in the other direction. That meant we now had a clear path to a position behind the redoubt from which we could stage our attack. If only 8th Group had also eluded their flank. We moved ahead at a faster pace. I wasn't sure how much time we had before light, but I knew it wasn't much. The Ramaklin had positioned their defenses so that the sun would rise in the eyes of Sharaban's attacking force. We had to time our diversionary action so that they would have the same problem when they faced us. If they were blinded by the first rays of sunlight hitting them at eye level, that would wipe out some of their advantage. Once again the three of us moved as one, and I began to feel more confident. I speeded our pace until I sensed that we were close to the redoubt. I stopped, took out my night vision lens, and there it was, the distinctive outcropping of rock that faced our side. We had calculated correctly, and there wasn't much more distance to travel. Judging from the faint ghosting of light on the horizon line, there also wasn't much time before we became visible. We started our final move around to the rear of the rock. The ghosting light was also creeping toward the redoubt, and the slight movement of a solar wind began to stir the air around us. I was aware that the success of the mission now depended on how well we were able to work with the elements. More I thought I was aware. Just as I was looking for 8th Group and a place to stop, a faint and sudden shadow accompanied by a whooshing sound and slap of air flew by my head. My heart leaped into my mouth. I thought we were being attacked. And we were, but not by the Ramaklin. I looked up, and a swarm of Hanj were taking advantage of the faint light to do some hunting. We must have looked like well-fed sandworms. I could now make out the outlines of 3 and 4. Cover your heads and stay still, I whispered. They'll pass. I pulled my sun cover down and curled up. I felt a sharp, painful stab on my shoulder, but I didn't react. I wanted them to pass without drawing the attention of the enemy. Get away. Get away from me. 3 was on his feet, screaming at the attacking Hanj who were screaming in response. His huge form was now the focus of their attention, as he waved his phaser and tried to take aim. He stumbled over 4. Get down, 3. We'll be spotted. I whispered hoarsely, but I knew it was too late. Who's there? The Ramaklin soldier called out from the rock. What are we going to do? They know we're here. 4's eyes were enormous. 3 was still doing his grotesque dance to ward off the Hanj, who were cutting and slashing from all directions. The predators obviously had drawn blood and were going for more. The light was growing stronger. We had to take some action. Declare yourself or we'll fire, the same Ramaklin voice demanded. Cover me, I told 4. What are you going to do? He asked. Just keep the Hanj off me. I jumped up. It's all right. We've got him, I announced. It's a single Sharaban probe. We've got him. I could barely make out figures above the rock line. I fired my phaser at a Hanj slashing toward my face. It went down. 4 hit another. 3 let out a horrible scream. I was desperately looking for 8's team. Who are you? Another voice asked from the rock. 1 loop back. I lied. Ramaklin flank. The Sharaban probe was attacked by Hanj. The Hanj had been driven off by the phaser fire, and 3 was now eerily silent. He turned to me, and the right side of his face was covered in blood. When I looked closer I could see that the eye socket was empty. He was in shock, and totally disoriented. I aimed my phaser and stunned him into unconsciousness. What are you doing, 10? 4 cried out. He's under control. I yelled to the rock. Book content text. Bring him in. The second voice ordered. I wondered if this was one Ramaklin. Weary coming. I answered. I started to lift 3, but his dead weight was impossible. Help me, 4. You're not going to bring him to them? He was incredulous. No, we are. Now help me, I ordered. 4 hesitated. We have no choice. We use him as cover to get there and then begin our attack. That's our assignment. Now help me or you're on report! 4 got up, looked around fearfully for any remaining Hanj and then helped me lift the huge body. It was then he saw 3's right eye was missing. He nearly lost his hold. Steady, 4! His eye! Weary coming, I yelled. Let's go. I said to the horrified four, as we struggled to the rock, trying to keep the body in front of us to mask our Sharaban green uniforms as opposed to the Raymaclin black. I detected movement to my right. Let it be 8, I thought. As soon as we get close enough, we have to force our way inside before they can use their phasers. Use 3 as a shield. I was almost breathless with effort, and 4 could only grunt in response. Just as we approached the rock, I could see that 3 or 4 Raymaclin soldiers were massed at an opening, waiting for us. About 20 paces away, sunlight suddenly beamed straight past us and lit up their bodies and faces as the sun came over the horizon behind us. The timing couldn't have been better. Steady, for on my signal, I whispered with what little breath I had left. We came closer. There were 4 of them, very distinct in their identifying black vests, shielding their eyes and training their phasers on us. Stop, one of them said. We were 5 paces away. Put the body down, he instructed. Of course, I replied. Don't let go, I whispered to 4. I began to stumble toward them as if I had lost my balance. Stop. The voice repeated. I am sorry. I lost my footing, I apologized. We were 2 paces away. Wait. He's not. One of them began to say. Now. I cried, and using 3 as a barrier, and I pushed through the opening and knocked at least 2 of them over before they could use their phasers. We were inside and the fight had begun in earnest. Here they come. I heard someone yell, and in the chaos that followed I couldn't be sure if he meant us, 8th team, or the main force. All I know is that 4 and I immediately moved into a shifting tandem stratagem, and we fought like we were possessed by the spirit and strength of many. The advantage of surprise was ours. Fear and pumping fluids fueled us. It became a blur of action and reaction, parry and blow, shift and stand, attack and defend. There was no space in between, no moment of thought or pause. I was hit several times, but I felt nothing. At one point, I saw 7 fighting like a screech crab, and I fought even harder, encouraged by his ferocity of heart, which I had doubted. Over here, 10. I followed the call for help without hesitation. I had lost 4, but by now the main force had joined the fray, and the fighting was scattered over the entire area. It was Fat Sharaban being pummeled by 3 Raymaclin soldiers. He was doing his best and moving with surprising agility, but to no avail. I grabbed one and threw him off, but before I could turn back I was picked up from behind like I was a baby and tossed hard against a rock face. The air was crushed out of me, and I was on my hands and knees desperately trying to draw it back in, but before I could Fat Sharaban was thrown on top of me, and I began to suffocate. This was my worst fear. Besides the memory of Tane's punishment, I was tortured by nightmares in which I was buried alive. The red, insane surge of energy came from somewhere inside me, and with a scream I threw to Sharaban off me, grabbed the closest Raymaclin who was twice my size and was probably the one who'd thrown me against the rock, and used every skill I had learned in the pit to punish him for bringing me face to face with my nightmare death. The expression on the big Raymaclin was one of shock and incomprehension as I hit and kicked and elbowed. Book content text. And OWCHT. The action had become suspended in another reality. Everything else dropped away as this student became the focus for all my rage and fear. Suddenly I felt hands all over my body and I was pulled away. That's enough. 10. I heard a familiar voice say. No, it's not enough. I didn't recognize my voice. I thought someone else had spoken for me. It wasn't until the hands had gotten control of me that my anger began to subside and I came back from wherever I had gone. The faces of the people holding me back began to look familiar. The first one I saw was 8. Didn't you hear the signal? We've won. He was looking at me with real concern. My face felt wet, and I wondered where the moisture had come from. I wanted to ask him what had happened. I knew, looking in 8's eyes, that he would always tell me truth. But I didn't ask. I felt ashamed. It's over, Lubac. This time I recognized Sharaban. It's over. More, I thought I recognized him. This was yet another Sharaban, but this one was a slightly distorted image of the original. It's a mask, I thought. Then I remembered what had happened to me underneath to Sharaban's massive bulk, trying to draw breath. and I realized that the moisture on my face was my tears. Get up, Lubac, he said with a hearty and somewhat wooden jocularity. It's a new mask, it didn't have his usual grace. We're heroes. He turned to the gathering crowd. We've broken all records for the competition, he announced. Victory? He thrust his fist to the sky. Victory? The crowd repeated. For the Empire. Sharaban thrust again. Victory? They responded even louder. It was astounding. The mask was softening and integrating into the rest of Sharaban. As he interacted with the crowd of students, as he accepted their adulation and fealty, I could see that he was taking ownership of this new persona with increasing confidence. Could anyone else see this? I looked around. I was surrounded by masks. I looked at 8. His mask was stoic, but his eyes were always there, constant. Did he see what I saw? Valentine would laugh at such a question. How could he? I answered myself. He is his own eyes. I struggled to my feet, with 8's help. My body felt broken beyond repair. Breathe. Don't stop breathing no matter how much it hurts, 8 instructed. I tried to follow his directive, and gasped as the air turned into broken glass as it entered my lungs. I desperately wanted to share in the joy of victory I saw on the faces surrounding me, but the moment was so mixed with physical pain and with another, more complicated feeling. I didn't like what had happened to me when Fat Sharaban's body had nearly swallowed me, being overcome by the fear of never drawing breath again. I was also disturbed by what I saw in Sharaban's face, and somehow, vaguely, the two were related. I tried to shake off these feelings and thoughts and join in the celebration. And with 8's help, I was able to pull myself back into this moment of triumph. Book content text 19 entry : There was an almost surreal quality to Bamaran the next day. The institute looked like a clean and orderly outpost harboring the sick, wounded, and disfigured from some horrific war. With the help of a cane, I walked with a painful, crouching limp. My right leg and back were just short of being broken. Others were not so fortunate. The infirmaries were overflowing with serious cases like 3, who had lost his eye, and worse. Those races who accuse cartel science of being nothing better than mindless predators would rest their case if they saw the elite of our youth on the morning after the competition. At a special assembly in the outdoor arena, the Bamaran students gathered as Sharaban and one Ray McLean stood on the sunken stage waiting for us. I sat with 8 and the other Lubacs, and we dedicated our lives and loyalty to the Empire in a rousing version of Cartel Science Forever. Unity was the stated theme of their rally, but the actual business was the transference of power from Ray McLean to Sharaban, a ritual that was performed by the opposing factions after every competition to legitimize a new order. With a brittle dignity, Ray McLean handed the Bamaran saber, the symbol of student leadership, to one Sharaban, who graciously accepted it. In his speech, he praised the Ray McLean side for their courageous and well-planned opposition, and we all cheered, knowing that never in the history of the competition had a side capitulated so quickly. As I watched him speak, I tried to remember that moment the day before when I had clearly seen him assume the mask of leadership. What was it I saw in that moment that continued to nag at me? Could I even trust what I saw, given the state I was in? But his mastery was so complete now, his speech and carriage so elegant and reassuring, that I let the memory of that moment go and joined the others in acceptance and adulation. I scanned the audience from my vantage point, looking for Paladine. This was one of the few occasions when males and females were brought together. The females had their own competition and leadership structure, but we all participated in any major group ritual. I finally located her sitting down near the front. She was strongly focused on the ritual transfer and on Sharaban. I understood that she'd soon be preparing for her own competition, and that whatever transpired here today would have special meaning for her. And then it happened. The irony, of course, was that I had gotten past my mixed feelings of yesterday and was basking in the glow of our victory. I even enjoyed the aches and pain of my body as evidence of my participation. I accepted Sharaban's patronage and leadership, and was prepared to serve as a member of his council. At one of our last planning sessions, Sharaban had told me that after we'd won the competition he was going to ask me to join the council as his second-level liaison, a prestigious position that would consolidate my own base of power. I was about to become a member of the inner circle of Bamaran leadership. As Sharaban introduced each member of his council, with his title and a brief description of his duties. To Sharaban would coordinate and organize the council agenda. Drabert would oversee all school training programs. I watched, becoming increasingly intoxicated with a nervous excitement. As a young boy playing in the Tarlac sector, my dreams and fantasies had been fueled by a desire for this kind of recognition. I grabbed hold of my cane, determined not to stumble as I made my way down to the front. And last, for the important position of second-level liaison, which requires someone who is able to represent his entire level in such a way as to assure their voice in all policy matters. All first and second level business would funnel through me before it reached the council. The power of the position was self-evident. I positioned my good leg so that I could rise without wobbling. Kate, anticipating that I would be called, was ready to assist if necessary. Book content text. 9 loop back ! I started to rise, expecting a correction. I had heard the words, but my body was programmed to go. Kate, however, grabbed my elbow and prevented me from making an even bigger fool of myself. 9 loop back! But there was no correction. 9, sitting almost directly in front of me, rose to the cheers and applause that rightfully belonged to me. 9 loop back! I had a violent urge to vomit. 8 turned to me. I thought he was going to instruct me to breathe again, but he knew better. I retreated inside and put on a neutral mask. At the end of the ceremony we rose and chanted the 10 obligations and ended with victory! For the Empire! 3 times. Kate, I knew it, wanted to speak, but I remained behind the mask and hobbled off. I didn't want to speak to anyone. And I didn't. 4 days following the ceremony, I simply disappeared. Book content text. 20 entry : The truth is that I have come to enjoy tailoring. The problems of measuring, choosing the fabric and design suitable to the person and the occasion, cutting and putting the pieces together in a comfortable and attractive fit can keep my mind away from those realities over which I have no control. And the more difficult the problem, the more peace of mind I am able to maintain. Designing something for Odo, for example, is a unique challenge. He appeared in my shop one day and began to inspect the mounted displays as if there were hidden messages in the designs and arrangements. When I asked if there was something I could help him with, he replied that he was looking for some ideas. Changing style, are we? Odo shrugged, trying to appear unattached to such frivolous concerns. But I knew what this was all about. It was only a matter of time before he decided to make himself more attractive to Kira. Yet as I tried to elicit the specific details of what he wanted, he became shy and reticent, almost irritable. Something that's not so baggy, he said as he impatiently gestured to his drab constable uniform. I could understand his concern. Major Kira's tightly wrapped figure made us all look baggy. I looked up from Odo's designs, stretched, and felt a twinge of stiffness in my lower back. I had lost track of time, and decided that a short walk would relieve the tension that had accumulated from holding the same physical position for so long. As I came through the doors I nearly ran into Drive Bashir. Doctor. What an unexpected surprise. And it was. For both of us. Alone. Garak. I realized that his breathiness was a cover for the awkwardness of this chance encounter. Was he passing by? Coming in? Standing here debating with himself? Can I offer you some tea? I asked, perversely ignoring his discomfort. I don't want to be a bother. I'm sure you're busy, he gently demurred. No bother. Your timing's impeccable, as always. I was just taking the break. It's that time of day, isn't it? Bashir smiled and accepted the invitation. I led the way back into the shop, and while I coaxed 2 teas, 1 red leaf and 1 Earl Grey from my ancient replicator in the back, the doctor strolled about as if he were genuinely interested in the various sartorial displays. He was clearly ill at ease, and I wondered how the gulf between us had widened to such an extent. I was determined to narrow it. Who was this Earl Grey person? I asked, as I cleared a space for us at the counter and positioned 2 stools. I don't really know. Probably a rich man in our 19th century who came up with this blend, he speculated. More money than taste, I replied. The smell of the tea always put my teeth on edge. Even with his discomfort, Bashir's laugh had an ease and charm that reminded me of someone else. We remained silent as we sipped our respective teas. Sounds from the promenade drifted in. I understand that you were quite the knight in shining armor the other day, he said, breaking the silence, obviously referring to my escapade with the Klingon giant. Please, Doctor, it's an incident best forgotten by everyone, I replied. Why? You behaved honorably not only toward the Durbo girl, but with the Klingon soldier as well. Staying with him like that when he was suffering was well beyond the call of duty, the doctor said sincerely. Are you embarrassed by what you did? I am embarrassed by the attention it's brought me. Please, let's say no more about it, I requested. The doctor shook his head and went back to his tea. We drifted into another silence.